Okay. Oh, okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ken McLeod. I'm very pleased to be here with my colleagues Anne Klein. I always get your university mixed up. Anne Klein and David Germano. The panel discussion is Language of Contemplative Experience. I'm going to take a couple of minutes and describe the format that we have chosen. We want to maximize the opportunity for discussion. So each of us is going to take a half hour. We'll have a 5 to 7 minute presentation, followed by about 10, 12 minutes of discussion. Each of us are going to give you a topic, a way of something to talk about. For these discussions, we'd like you just to choose 2 or 3 people that are immediately around you. However, we would very much appreciate if you choose 2 or 3 different people in each of the 3 sessions, so you actually maximize the number of people you have a conversation with. You aren't having it with the same 3 people in every section. Is that clear? And then at the end, we're getting ridiculously complicated, I know. And then at the end of that, we'll take some general questions. And at the end, if we have enough time, then we'll have a plenary session with further questions about anything that's come up. Is that clear? Do you want me to run through that again? No. Okay. There are 2 handouts. There's a small one which has the material that Anne and I will be covering later after Anne's section of the panel discussion. Then we'll distribute the more substantial handout from David. And I think that covers the logistics. David, is there anything else that I haven't covered? No? No? Okay. Now, when we got together over Skype, we had several meetings over the last couple of months, very fruitful discussions. And what we discovered is that all of us agreed very much on, since this is the language of contemplative experience, experience is the central theme. We also discovered that each of us had a very different take on experience. And one way of putting it is that we're going to take you through a process of increasingly complex interaction or understanding of what is involved with experience. So I get the simplest part and takes another step, and then David gives you another context. And so this is a kind of building up of layers. Now, so I'm going to speak personally, and I've found that the conversations that we've had so far in this conference very enriching, but in their own way a little intimidating, because I feel that every point that I was going to make has already been said more than once, so there may be a little repetition here. My own journey in translation is somewhat different, I think, from many of yours. I found myself as Kalu Rinpoche's translator with no formal training in Tibetan a year after I had met him. And it's strange when you are the only person in a room who is meant to know both languages, and you have a lot of people in the room who know only one. After a while, you do know both languages. So in this, my own process in translation has gone through a lot of changes. And one of the key things that I want to express here is, for me, probably the biggest hurdle, one actually I face even today, is to move in the face of fear. And initially, the fear that I felt was, we were dealing with Tibetan as a sacred language. We all come from that perspective. I was very encouraged to hear today that there aren't any sacred languages, and that there are just languages, and the emphasis on the vernacular that we heard this morning was very reassuring also. So what I found that I had to do was to get away from the idea that if I wasn't absolutely accurate, I would be missing something and I wouldn't be transmitting something or translating something. Because as long as I was focused on accuracy, getting exactly the right word or trying to emulate the grammar exactly, I came up with, well, the favorite word seems to be clunky translations, and they really, really bothered me. And I found that the more that I just, okay, there's that fear there, just go for good English. And one of the ways that helped me go for good English, if I can get my phone to open, there we go, is what has already been suggested. So here's what I aspire to in my own translations, and you can take it from there. Now, as I was young and easy and under the apple boughs, about the lilting house and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes, and honored among wagons, I was prince of the apple towns, and once below a time, I lordly had the trees and leaves trailed with daisies and barleys down the rivers of the windfall light. This, of course, is Dylan Thomas, who makes the English language sing like nobody else that I know. Bob Dylan doesn't do a bad job, Leonard Cohen, and many, many others, but I've never found anybody that touches Dylan Thomas. And I found it immensely helpful to read these kinds of things, to get that idea of having the English language sing, and that is something that I've tried to do in my translations. Now, in the handout, you'll see that I've mentioned about 7 points that I had to develop in myself. One of the most important was to trust my own experience and practice and translate relying on that experience. And one of the consequences of that is that my translations have changed over time. But they've remained true in a certain sense because they're coming out of personal experience. Otherwise, I'm trying to guess at the experience of other people. But the one key feature that I want you to take to heart, and I want you to base your discussions on, is that in my own translations, I seek to elicit in the reader of the English experiences that are comparable to the experiences that I have when I read the Tibetan. And so less and less do I pay attention to the exact words or even the exact grammar. I look for different kinds of constructions in English, different wordings, even different metaphors if necessary, that I think will bring out that kind of experience, and particularly in the language of Dzogchen and Mahamudra, where so much is about stopping the conceptual mind. That is what I'm seeking to do in translation. So with that as a basis, what I'd like you to do now, you'll find that there are 4 examples in my section of the handout. There's a couple of lines which are almost philosophical, which could come out of almost any Mahamudra text. These were sent to me by a woman currently in a 3-year retreat, and asking me to put them into clear English, because the only translation that she had was one of very philosophical, technical terms. Another is from a song by Jigme Lingpa, Dzogchen master. The third one is also from that same one, illustrates a different point. And the fourth one is from Tilopa's Song to Mahamudra. So I'd like you to divide up into groups of 3 or 4 people and explore what experience is the author writing about? And what experience do you have when you read those lines? And how would you give expression to that experience in English? And I'd like you to engage that discussion now, okay? Use the Tibetan. If you don't know the Tibetan, then rely on the English. The English is my translations. So, you can have the discussion in English, of course, and just talk about it. What is the experience of the author? What do you glean from those lines? Of the original. Pardon? Exactly. Yes. Don't worry about the translation for now. Thank you. Okay, go.
Okay, so now they have
10 minutes.
10 minutes. So it's
Yeah, I got it.
till about 5 up. Okay, good.
I think I just stuck into.
What?
I think I managed just to stay in time. It goes quick.
that very quickly. I'm trying to find a file.
Really not used to it. Oh, I'm really not used
We're
to
Mike.
Your mic's too loud. So if you're going to talk, just cut them out. Oh, yeah.
She said not to turn them on.
Buddhist interpreting things. Other than letters, do you also find figures in any of these wooden panels that you find?
Your section is meant to be done by 3:15. I mean, we started late. They're about 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Will he know when to get... Oh, good point. I think they're on now.
Oh, the mics? Oh, they're on. Okay. Another couple of minutes in your discussion. Okay, if you could wind up your discussions, please. This business of getting people to come back together, it's always difficult. Okay, could I have your attention, please? Well, thank you. So,
The mic's not working?
let's take the first
Is your mic working?
sample in Tibetan. How many groups discussed that one?
Is it?
Okay, so what were some of your thoughts about,
Is his
based
mic
on the
working?
questions that I posed to you?
Yeah.
That's a very good point. More parallelism in the translation. Do we have mics? Yeah. And the person said wanted to see more parallelism. This is a very important point because generally speaking, whenever I come across a passage which is a definite parallel structure, I do everything I can to preserve it. Because the parallelism is often there so that people can memorize it more easily. And we want the same thing to happen in English wherever possible.
I think it's not only a question of memorizing, but it also informs meaning, because this is, it's the subject and the object that are being dealt with here, and they're set in opposition to each other.
Okay.
So I think that's also important.
Thank you. Any other observations? In particular, going to the, what experience do you have when you read that line, and and we can give it back to, yes, please.
So I'm familiar with this line from the Judenlana sadhana and how it has the Sobhava mantra and the Shunyata mantra as a part of that.
Familiar. It's so long since I've read it in Tibetan.
So it really makes more sense when there are those mantras to sort of punctuate the experience, where you say the mantra and then you explain the meaning. You say the next mantra and you explain the meaning. And when that was not present here, it becomes a whole different thing.
Okay, so what you're saying here is that context is very important. Okay. Right. Yes.
Excuse me, I would like to understand why Che Tamche Tompanido is translated by all experience is empty.
Which part, is it the empty part or the all experience part?
J'ai pas compris.
Well,
all experience is empty.
all experience, yeah. The reason I translate it as empty rather than emptiness is that it works better grammatically in English. The reason I translate Che Tamche almost always as all experience is that quite a long time ago, I came to the conclusion that phenomenon or phenomena was a very bad translation of Che. or the word dharma in this context. And what dharma really referred to was a unit of experience. And it's not something out there, it's something that arises in the mind. And so Korde Chu Tamche, all the experience of samsara and nirvana. It's the totality of experience. Chu Ying is the totality of experience, dharma dhatu. And I found it, and even words like Chu Nyi, which dharmata is experience-ness, if you want to put it into bad English. But I found that using that term, experience, rather than phenomenon or any of the other alternative, and definitely not dharma, because that's bringing another Sanskrit word into English, this communicates to people very, very clearly, particularly from contemplative perspective, where you're focusing on what are you actually experiencing in each moment. What is the experience in each moment? You're not talking about what's out there as something out there. You're talking about what is arising in the mind, whether they're sensations, whether they're thoughts, whether they're feelings. Okay. Yes?
That's really interesting. I've never heard Chu Tamche as all experience. I just have heard I work with Richard Barron, and he likes to say that he has parking spots for different terms. So like, for example, nyongwa would be experience. That's his parking spot for experience, is nyongwa. So in other words, do you try to have a kind of terminology in your toolbox where experience is now for you chu? You know what I'm trying to say?
Well, I was very gratified to hear Thupten Jinpa say this morning, quoting Wittgenstein, the meaning of a word is its use. Because Wittgenstein argued very, very strongly against the representational theory of language and looked at language as a toolbox. And I was deeply influenced by reading Wittgenstein in my early 20s. A friend of mine handed me his volume of philosophical investigations and said, read this, this is not a negotiation. And I'm very, very grateful to him for that, because it changed the way that I understood language, and I always looked at it in this way of how is it actually being used. So no, I don't have parking spots. I would translate nyongwa as experience too. And what I'm concerned with here is rather than transposing the various word maps and meaning maps in Tibetan into English, which I don't think is a practical venture anyway, I'm far more concerned with making the English completely intelligible and transparent in the sense that people don't get the sense they're reading a translation, as was noted yesterday, that they're just reading English. And so that the meaning of the English goes into them without them even knowing that it's going into them. That's my objective in translation. Okay. Klaus.
I want you to share a thought, maybe it's relevant, in the Chöni Namche by Maitreya.
Yes?
I'm sorry. Yeah, in the Chöni Namche by Maitreya, the Dhammata Vibhaga, Chö is defined as Sungsin Nisu Nangwa. I mean, the definition is a little bit longer, but basically it means a dualistic appearance, or appearance as object to be grasped and a perceiving subject. And in this sense, you're right, to bring an experiential term into it, because it's not only the object, but it's also the perceiving subject of what is presencing itself.
Yeah, it's that whole thing.
Yeah, and I think this is quite relevant for this verse, because we are talking about the emptiness of Sung Sin.
Yes.
Exactly. So the essencelessness, like the Rangshin.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know whether this helps.
No. Well, thank you for your comment. Let's move on to. Did any groups look at the second sample?
Hello.
Hello.
Since the original Tibetan text says Sungwa Rangshi Mebe Dani To and Zimba Rangshi Mimik De, then the conclusion is Chö Tamje Tongpa Nyi To, right? So therefore, at least I think in the first two sentences you have, there should be included the translation of Rangshin, Rangshi Meba. So Rangshi Meba and or there's a nothing, or there's a nothing inherently existence. So
Actually, I did include it.
I don't see that here.
Yes, it's the word there. See, as soon as you introduce the word of nature, you bring in a whole idea of English philosophy or Western philosophy about essence and things like that. And rather than engage that, because the point here, this occurs in a sadhana, and the point here is to move people out of the conceptual mind. So rather than bring in that whole stream of philosophy, I want to do this as subtly as possible. And quoting Gertrude Stein with respect to Oakland, there's no there. Which Oakland has never recovered from. But so there is nothing there. That's giving the idea of nature. There's nothing there. And now that's a very free translation. That I preface this with the comment that what I'm aiming for here is to communicate the experience. I'm not so concerned with communicating the philosophy. I'll be very clear about that.
Well, the author of this clearly says, "Sungwa rangshi mebe dani to." So it both zimba rangshi meba, both clearly saying the author. So you are only translating the author's work, right? So you should convey the meaning of that. Otherwise, it will end up there's nothing at all. It end up with there's nothing, external phenomena or subjective phenomena.
No, I understand where you're going, and I would say I would just beg to differ. I'd like to move now, because my time's very limited here, to the fourth one, because there are a couple of points I want to make about that. Did any of you discuss the fourth sample here? Here, in this is the opening stanza of Tilopa's song to Naropa. And the occasion is Tilopa has just finished slapping Naropa with his shoe because Naropa, trying to be a human bridge over a small little creek, after Tilopa jumped up and down on him, allowed the very tip of Tilopa's sandal to touch the water. And so Tilopa grabbed him and slapped him across the face, which, as you know, in Eastern cultures is the worst insult, to slap somebody with your shoe, because it's walked on the dirty ground. And in this horribly humiliating experience, Naropa wakes up. And this is how Tilopa opens the song. Now, what my aim was here, being a teacher, probably the most wonderful and joyful experience you have is when you see a student in front of you touch nature of mind. Because at that moment, you can have a totally different conversation with a student you've never been able to have before. And that's what Tilopa experienced at this point. And so what I wanted to do here was to imbue the English with the warmth and the joy that Tilopa was feeling when Naropa woke up, and he was able to talk to him about Mahamudra in a totally different way. So any comments or questions about this that you'd like to pose? People are studying it. Yes, please.
In the fourth pada there, the fourth line, he says, Kelden Q, Kilola Ditar Ju. And it seems like this usage of the word you is it's screaming loudly in the Tibetan. Mm-hmm. I don't see you reflecting it in the English.
Well, my worthy student.
As a translator who struggles with these things, I just want to say I like that.
Could you amplify on that, Elizabeth?
Because he's addressing, yes, because he's addressing this, because he's addressing the students, so there's this personal quality about it with ch in Tibetan, which you don't often get. So you feel like you want to do something, right? You want to include that. And you here makes it sound stiffer. If you were to say, you take this to heart, you worthy student take this to heart. To me, that feels kind of stiff.
And I think you're pointing to the essential feature. The pronouns function differently in the different languages.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I like this. And I think this lola detar ch, where you say take it to heart, for that, I think that's also good. Yeah. It captures that, and it's got that that punch and sort of intimacy and imperative quality that if you just said, keep this in mind, it's like...
Yeah, well, that's exactly the process I went through. Keep this in mind. I went, no, that's, yeah. Thank you. Okay, any other comments? And then I'm going to turn it over to Anne. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. And it's great to be together and awake after lunch. So I really appreciate that. What? No, I'm not projecting. Just my voice. So my goal with respect to experience in this module, this part, is really to pay attention not so much to what words you think you want to use, although I'm sure you will not stop doing that, but really to how words feel. What comes for you when you relax and hear these words read out loud? And I'm going to ask you in your small groups to begin, if you would, in your group, just begin for 30 seconds or a minute and remind yourself that you have a body, because that's part of what we need to be in touch with when we are, being sensitive to how sound and words impact us. And we've heard about the importance of being kind to the reader, and I think that one kindness to the reader is to recognize that they have a body. They're not just a mind, and that's why we're so sensitive to rhythm and imagery too, actually. So I'll say more about that in a moment. And there are two passages here. I'm going to ask, for the sake of fullness of conversation, that everybody, if there were a line down the middle here, that everybody on this side of the line in your group focus on the first passage, unless you really feel you have to do the second passage, and this side of the room do the second passage. So the first passage, there are two verses. There's the famous praise to perfection of wisdom, spoken by Rahula, the eater of the moon, Masam Jume Shero Parochin, expressing the very thing that we have been worrying about in a way. He's telling us that we can't express the inexpressible. And in Jigme Lingpa's commentary, just 4 lines of it here, very interesting that he explains what's different about Ma and Sam and Je, and why none of the three of them will work to express reality itself. And just to give an example, his commentary on the first line, he says that the essence of saying is speech, that's the Ma, and its essence is wind, lung, prana. So, of course, wind, in this case, he's talking about the wind that moves through the body, and the way in which using ordinary words with an ordinary mind is always going to send your wind, through the karmic sides of the body, and you can't speak wisdom when your energy is moving that way. So I realized only after I had chosen this that this was actually quite in sync thematically with what I'm asking you to explore in our little exercise here. The second verse is from Jigme Lingpa's Ngöndro, and I took it upon myself to translate that Ngöndro into what I call chantable English, namely that the English meter matches the Tibetan meter, so 7 syllables or 9 syllables. And that is a very particular cage to lock yourself into, as a really appreciated Curtis's discussion of poetry this morning, and he showed different kinds of cages that you could put yourself in, that you were trying to meet. So that was mine, and I wanted to do it so that it could be sung to the traditional Tibetan melody. But I give, in both cases, I give what chantable English as well as non-chantable English, so without those constraints kinds of translations. And this was actually one of the hardest things to get into chantable English. It has really centrally crucial dzogchen terms about which many books have been written. So how to do that in simple English. And, I'm just interested in how it impacts you to hear it in, even though chantable English is 7 and 9 syllables, is not really ideal, as Ken was explaining to me earlier today, for the way English words go. But how does that affect you? How does I will ask you to read the Tibetan aloud to each other, and also both the prose and the chantable translations. How's my time? Am I done?
No,
I have
got about 3 more
I have
minutes.
3 minutes. Let's see if I need them. What else am I saying? Well, just one interesting to me anyway, that in this particular way, in my first training in epistemology, which has never left me, was, Gelukpa and Sautrantika, Lorik, and all that really, really good Sema and all that really good stuff. And of course, there the reason, so to speak, that words can't express reality is because words and thought are always too general. One way to talk about it. They're always like projecting something out there on whatever is being named. And so you can't get the naked thing. You can't just be in direct experience when you're talking. And so very interesting that Jigme Lingpa here is not really worried about that. He's not worried about the conceptual abstracting thing that happens when we talk and name. He says, no, the problem is, your winds. So that's one of the things he says, your winds are going in the wrong channel. You can't get it when your body is in that way. Okay, so if you would please, start, if you would, take a moment and just, be with your body. Take a moment of rest to get out of your head for a minute, and then select somebody in the group to read. Were you going to say something?
Remind them to choose different people.
Oh, yes, and please choose different people than you played with before. Just see how the reading impacts you. And then you can talk about the translation.
Very good. We covered it.
Is this mine? Is that yours?
You got it done. You got it done in 7 minutes.
I forgot to check the time when I stood up there.
No, you were fine.
So we're gonna get back together.
They like to talk.
Just say, can I have your attention?
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. That's what we want, echoing. That's Janet's resonance, right? Reflective resonance. So then, what happened when you heard and or read? Some of you were readers, perhaps, more than listeners and feelers. I guess we'll start with this half of the room, although some of you from this half perhaps read. Yes? Oh, would you please say who you are as you're about to speak? It's very nice.
My name is Lama Tempa. I'm reading your translation, the yi, as a mental function.
Yeah.
What did you, and how could you explain yi as mental function?
Well, the commentary explains that this is a yila cheba, and Jigme Lingpa very clearly says that this is the doer of the mind, and I think in the chantable translation I even called it the doer of mind, something like that, mental doing. Mental functioning, it's something people use. It's a really hard word to translate. You know, for us, here is one place where Tibet has more words for mind than we really can match in English. You know, sem and yi and yila cheba and sheba and all of that. Lo. And so I guess I just wanted to get across the idea that this is because in this verse what seems to be important is that Jigme Lingpa at least is making a distinction between sem and the activity of mind. And so that's why. And I acknowledge it's not beautiful.
I like it actually.
You like it? Oh. Did you like hearing it?
No, I like it about meaning.
Yeah. Okay.
This is how I explain yi, right? Yi is manas.
Exactly.
And manas is activity of mind.
Yeah, or manasikara. And yeah, exactly. I like its meaning too, because it does say what is happening. But in poetry,
I see.
You know, so
thank you.
That's why we give both. Yeah, thank you very much, Lama. Anybody else? What was listening to it like? Did that work as an experiment for you? We know they did it before they translated King James Bible, so, and but we're not in an oral culture. So, how was that, Renee?
My name is Renee Ford. Our group collectively, I think we were talking about how much the context of which we were reading something in really influenced our experience of it. We were discussing here in a conference setting that we were adhering a lot more to trying to understand it conceptually, and
I know I was trying to throw a wrench into that.
I know the wrench wasn't big enough, I guess.
Yeah.
And then noticing that it can read or feel quite differently in other settings.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, back there.
Hello, my name is Christian Bernard from Chudung Carmel. And in our group we discussed mainly the homage to the Mother Wisdom, not the second. Actually, I'm not clear if we were supposed to read that and the commentary.
If you wished, yes, but
anyway, we didn't.
Okay.
We did only the homage.
Okay.
And what was interesting is in the third line, the Sosoranri Yeshe Choyulma, that in the Padmakara version, it seems to be almost like a commentary explaining what this Sosoranrik means. And this Sosoranrik is understood completely different in the two other versions. And that gave a very different experience. So our friend here, what is your name?
Can you say, yeah?
Sarah, you want to say? No, okay. So I'll speak for Sarah.
Please speak
She
for
said
Sarah.
that she had the most feeling, the strongest experience by reading the first one, because the Sosoranrik was actually interpreted in a different way through explaining each individual has the capacity to experience, which is very long, of course,
right,
but it gives another feeling to that Sosoranrik,
right,
which is
so
missing in the other two.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was a richer context, what was happening. He really is, I think, moving from Gampopa's etymology in a way of sosogebo, you know, that yeah, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah, Gerardo, okay.
My name is Nick, and to follow up on that same point, it seems that the Pimmakara translation reads the choyo-wa instead of choyo-ma.
Yes, that seems to be a variation. That's why I wrote that there, and I went with the choyo-ma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it makes a really big difference, I
Yes.
think, because with the ma, then it refers back to prajna paramita, but then with the wa, it can be more subjective or according to whoever is teaching or chanting.
It can be more subjective? I didn't
Yeah,
quite hear the
it
end of
becomes like in the Pimmakara, they say each individual has a capacity, and also in the Pema Translation Committee, also they say a similar thing. It's a realm of your own self-knowing, timeless. I'm reading worse. I can't remember, but it's a realm of your own sosotope.
Right, exactly.
So I just wanted to bring up that it's a very substantial difference.
Thank you. Yes, it's a big difference. And that's part of the reason I went with I think my text had a ma in it, and I went with that, because I think there it is talking more specifically about, as you said, the parchen itself and everything of that.
Okay, I'm Gerardo Abud, and
What?
Gerardo Abud,
Yes,
that's
no.
my name. I know it's a difficult name, but I do, you know.
I know your name. I thought you were already on something else.
No, the Prajnaparamita, Rahula's composition, you know, that I've read this, or I found this in many different places, and it is not Sosor, it is Sosorangrik. And not only here, but in many of the Mahamudra texts and Dzogchen texts, they come again and again saying Sosorangrik, no Sosor, which makes a big difference, I think, you know, because like if you say Sosor Rangrig, then it is okay to say each individual and more or less how it is here. But if it is Sosor Rangrig, it's actually a very difficult way to understand it. And I've asked many Khenpos, you know, and each Khenpo has his own version. Are you surprised at that?
Very surprised.
So one Khenpo said that because usually you find it translated as individual awareness wisdom, right? Or something like that. Like that means to say my rangrig, your rangrig, and so forth. But then most Khenpos don't agree with that. But then one says it's like a kona, you know, like only rangrig
really?
yeshe will know prajnaparamita.
Wow.
Another Khenpo, the last one I saw just a month ago, said is a little bit like ni, which is a bit like koma, like itself. It is a rangrig itself, which can know prajnaparamita, right? And so I don't know. It's not. I would like to know if anybody has any kind of better translation for sosorangrig. This is the first time I see this quotation with a ra, you know, and it changes quite a lot the meaning. That's why. Well, I wanted to bring this point up, yeah?
Yeah, and I actually didn't really read it that way. I mean, I really read it as Sosorangrik. And I did discuss this with, not so much with the Ra. Not with the chantable English, because I go into, you know, field of precise wisdom, and precise wisdom is a way of translating Sosor. Sosodope Yeshe.
You've got about 2 minutes.
Do you want that conversation?
I would love to hear more about this, but we only have like 2 minutes, so I'd like to hear if there is anything from this side of the room. Yes.
Well, in the Gyulama, you know, like you have Soso Rangirikpa. So you have Pratyatma Vedaniya, and it refers to the Buddha, you know, like who found enlightenment on his own, you know, without any other help. So he just, you know, without a teacher or any other help, he just. So in this sense, you know, like it is something to be realized by yourself. But then, you know, like there is a later explanation also, which I got from Khenpo, that, well, when you are at this stage where you are like realizing for yourself, you know, Buddhahood, then it must be a kind of direct, immediate, you know, like self-awareness. So it has also this meaning, you know. But originally it just means, you know, to realize for yourself.
I'm Ari Goldfield, and I really enjoyed listening to the chanted version, and in particular, wanted to comment on the second to last line. Real, you know, real is in English is a powerful word.
I know.
And I really, not to play with words, really like your ending the line with that. I didn't know what quelled meant there, but quelled in the real, that felt good. So I like to translate like Yang Dak Bei Dun as the real deal.
Real deal.
Real is, you know, and it's interesting because it can be such a straw man, you know, in Tibetan. There's nothing real, but in English, like it's a really powerful experiential term. It has an effect.
Thank you. I'm glad you were able to override the philosophical claptrap that would interfere with that, because there's sort of no choice in chantable English. That was one of the hardest lines actually to get into, so few syllables. So I kind of had to use real, and thank you. I'm glad you liked it. I appreciate that. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And now, what?
Yeah, and then we want to take a general discussion.
But we want to have time for a general, yeah.
So we need to do goes quickly, doesn't it? Goes quickly, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I have enough copies because mine is a little bit longer. So just try to make sure you have one in your group. So this is, oh wait, I have to get my watch time. So this is a kind of different type of reflection that assumes the first two discussions, but I'm less concerned with the details of translating lines. You'll see that I gave you a lot of lines, although it is anchored in the translation of a single word that's embedded within the translation of all these pages. So the larger question I have in mind is something that's come up again and again over the last couple of days, which is when we're thinking about translation and transmission, and we consider these contemplative practices as forms of life that are communal as well as individual, and that these practices articulate those forms of life and in turn are articulated by them. And one possible consequence of this is that if we're translating and transmitting entire worlds of experience in our translations, then these worlds of experience are grounded in very specific communities, specific cultures, specific places, and times. And so there's also a temporality of translation that I think a lot about, which is deeply oriented both towards the past and to the future. We have to imagine a future world in which our translation makes sense, but simultaneously we're imagining a past world or a present world in which the original makes sense, or still makes sense somewhere, sometime, in some place for someone. And so instead of betrayal and resistance, which is something people have talked about in terms of translation, I think of translation first and foremost as a series of acts of love. And you have to love the language, but you also have to love the world. And you have to love the language in the world from which you're translating and the language in the world to which you translate. Otherwise, I think it's rather a failed enterprise. So what I want to consider today is the most important practice of the Dzogchen Ningtik, namely Tugel. And this practice is something that emerges in the 11th century in central Tibet. And I'm not going to go into the details, but the basic idea is you contemplatively cultivate spontaneous images of light. And there's a series of 4 visions, and ultimately the sky is filled with visions of Pure Lands, and then they all fade away. At least that's what some people think. That's a point of contention, as James Gentry could tell you. Another related question that I've thought about a lot the last number of years is the question of context, namely the relationship of contemplation and context, and whether any given context, whether or not it's in the literature, the degree to which it's constitutive of the contemplation. So if you take it away, the contemplation is fundamentally altered. And the context I have in mind today are the literary context, and in particular the symbolic, aesthetic, philosophical, and cultural context that are revealed in that literature. And so I'm also interested in the aesthetics of contemplation, beyond the procedures. You could say, do this, do that, etc. But when you look at the textual descriptions of the contemplation that I've given you, there's a rich symbolic world, a rich set of narratives that are articulated. And so if we think about the aesthetics of the practice, that's one thing we have to consider, as well as looking at the practices itself with its sensory appreciation, the role of beauty, and the type of realizations that take place through art, and how those factor in the contemplative practice. And so how do these aesthetics relate to the aesthetics of the literature that describe the contemplative practices? So as befits a discussion that's all about translation, I just have one word. So you can gripe about how I translated the other lines. I would gripe about it myself if I'd had time to polish it. But I just want to argue one word, and that word is lugugyu. Now, it's my favorite word, as some of you know. And there's no question how this word is created. The word luk means a sheep. And when you form a diminutive of a word, you take the last consonant, you put a shop Q under it, you delete the consonant, and you have lugu. It means a little sheep, otherwise known as a lamb. Now you could say little lambs, that's who knows, maybe that's like a little lamb, then there's big lambs, but lambs are young sheep. When you add a gyu, you basically have a succession, a chain of such lambs. Now, later, there's no question that in Tibetan literature, you see the word lugugyu used sometimes as like a chain or a succession. For example, Goldstein says, our work is like an assembly line, lugugyu. And then he has in parentheses, literally lambs in a row. Okay, so why are we talking about lambs, for those of you who are not already familiar with it? Well, I would say it's the single most important term in the description of Tugel literature. It's a term that they spend scores and scores of pages celebrating, talking about, etc. And in terms of the kind of early literature on Tugel, they say that there are the ying, the expanse, develops into the Pure Land. And the tikle, these concentric circles, develop into the palace. And the lugugyu develop into the Buddhas inside those palaces. And so these little linked lambs end up being the Buddhas in these visions of Pure Lands. Now, the phenomenology of the practice, these are just, they're floaters, the strands that float across your eye, which everybody's seen them. They're curving lines and little circles. Now, the beauty of this and the specificity of this and the Tibetan profundity of calling that little linked lambs was laid bare one late afternoon many years ago when I was in a place called, and I'll just translate the place name, White Skull Snow Mountain, or Kangri Tukar, the famous retreat center of Longchenpa, who without doubt was the greatest literary master of the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition. And I was climbing a hill, and all of a sudden there was this lamb. I don't know if it was a little lamb, but it was certainly a lamb. And that lamb was followed by another lamb. And ultimately there were 10 lambs, all connected together by the neck. And they were undulating up and down the hillside because they were grazing. And then a little Tibetan shepherd boy who was guiding the lambs quickly followed by. Now, for anyone who's considered the visual appearance of a floater, it's an undeniably appropriate image. But to take this profoundly Tibetan practice, an image, as the source of the visionary stepping into form of Buddhas, that's extraordinarily moving by any standard. It's also extraordinarily Tibetan. Now, when you translate that term as linked chains or some other antiseptic term, I think if there was a translation police, you would be in jail. So I've given you two passages, no offense, I've given you two passages here. The first one is a more philosophically inclined account of Tugel meditation by Longchenpa from the Sikdunse, the translation of, the Treasury of Words and Meaning. And the key passage here is on the bottom of page 7, where there's a very classic description of the practice that evokes a nomad herding lambs into a corral. And I'll just read it. The key point of awareness is keeping the eyes unwavering and mind undistracted, so that the dawning of the expanse's appearance, along with the little linked lambs, at which point you must seize hold of the little linked lambs within the expanse's fence, such they no longer fluctuate. A profoundly nomadic image. The second one I've given you is a narrative. It's from Longchenpa's Taekchokse, and it cites an allegory, an allegorical narrative, which is translated in Herbert Gunther's Tales of Wholeness, Lost and Regained, in a very wrong context, if you ask me, because the context is it's all about contemplation. And so Longchenpa's decoding of this, I translate the Tantra, then Longchenpa's interpretation of it, the key passage is in line 16. And so the narrative basically is about these two kids who their parents send them to the land of demons to go get some fire. And the son is like, no, I don't want to go. And say, no, you got to go. And he goes. There's a black demon. They imprison him. And something happens. He calls an army. They get out. He and the sister brings back flowers. And then they meet the teacher. They see a crystal stupa. I mean, of course. And then they look at the crystal stupas and things happen, etc. You read the narrative and you're thinking, that's interesting. Longchenpa interprets it, all the details, one by one, in terms of Tugel meditation, the experience of Tugel meditation, the philosophy of Tugel meditation. And the key passage here is in the bottom of page 16, where it says, examining from Malaya is that you look at those visions from the eyes, and you must identify awareness within the fence of the expanse. The same image of taking those, and it goes on to talk about the lambs and so forth. You're taking those lambs and corralling them into the field of reality, the Chiying. So the simplest question I have here, as I come to my conclusion, is if we took this one practice as an example of contemplative practices and their literary descriptions, and we stripped it of every association, of every image, if we took it out of this rich literature that celebrates it, that articulates it, that contextualizes it, that instructs us in it, and we just said, okay, we're going to cultivate these visions of light, would this be the same practice? And what is the impact of this richly symbolic evocation of it in the literature that describes it, which weaves profoundly philosophical reflections on the great topics of Buddhist philosophy into the intricate details of this sensory imaginary practice, and simultaneously contextualizes the practice in an intensely Tibetan cultural landscape and imagination? What's the impact of that? What do we do with that in a translation? And finally, what about the allegory narrative? Does the allegory add anything to our understanding, to our practice, to our experiences of Tugel meditation? And if it does add something, precisely what does it add? And then more broadly, this is a profoundly aesthetic meditation. It's one that's grounded in our sensory experience, and it's grounded in a sense of beauty, a Tibetan sense of beauty. And how do we take the aesthetics of that meditation and link it to the aesthetics of the texts that describe it, with poetry, with philosophical prose, technical descriptions, and allegorical narratives? So at the end of this, I listed a couple of topics of discussion that you can take, or the questions I just posed to you. Thinking about meditation as a form of life, thinking about the relationship of words and worlds in our translation process, the relationship of philosophy and contemplation, and meditation and literature. So instead of complaining about the way I translate anything other than Lugugyu, that you can complain about, think about these broader issues in the context of this allegory and this other account of Tugel meditation against these broader kind of questions. So thank you. Oh, you got to break together into new unprecedented triads. Yeah.
Yay, you did it. That's amazing.
Impressive.
What do you think the difference is of having that image? I mean, you could feel that it's quite impressive. I'll turn this off. to me, it's these other things that are right now most
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to thinking about why in our practice do we need wisdom. Wisdom is not just about emptiness. Wisdom is about understanding a rich fabric of Buddhist thought that these practices make sense of. And you might have the same set of experiences, but it's what precedes and what follows it that contextualizes it and roots it in a world of values and a sense of how we interact with each other and morality and cosmology and so forth. And so I would argue that it's everything. Without it, it's not a Buddhist practice. None of these are Buddhist practices. If all you do is you say, here's a set of procedures to do, now go do it, they may be helpful to you, but they're not.
Well, I'm not saying without any context. I'm saying within the sort of the basic social context of Buddha nature, Japanese and Sangye, all that kind of stuff. To me, already that's very rich.
So you mean specifically the little link lambs and that part of it?
Or even, I would say also the names of the various lamps are pretty stunning and amazing. And,
like naming the eyes as the water falling into the lasso instead of, yeah.
So I've never felt that, I don't know, you obviously see a lot in this video, and I've heard you talk about it before, and I think the connection with the little lambs walking up the hill, that's very powerful. I totally get, like, oh, I get it, that's what it is.
I don't know.
Ring.
Or
Hello, yeah.
Hey, there we are. Okay. Should we do our Kunshamsumne?
I think so.
Kunshamsumne, Whoa!
I don't know that one at all.
In 3 rules, Jules 3.
Okay, so we got to keep on schedule. Yeah, we're taking questions.
No complaints, just questions.
The floor is open for questions, comments, observations, poems, thoughts.
It's important for us to get a measure of
experiences, regrets. Why did I come to this one?
So my question is, to what extent do you think any kind of conceptual practice or language affects the unfoldment of the Nangwa? And does that evolve through the Nangwa, through the 4 stages of the appearances?
So you mean like in this specific practice? Or
well,
just any kind of contemplative practice?
Well, we were talking about Tugel,
right?
And you were talking about the 4 appearances of the 4 Nangwa. I think you translated appearances.
Yeah.
And you're also implicitly, you're talking about translation. You're talking about how the use of terminology may actually influence our experience.
Right.
And I'm questioning even fundamentally the extent to which prior conceptual experience affects the unfoldment of those Nangwa, and even if it does that not exhaust at some point through the Nangwa?
Well,
Ends nodding your head, so at least I think you understand my question.
Yeah.
Is that?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, the literature in question has a tremendous amount of guidance about what you do in the process of these spontaneous images. So it really is a cultivation of spontaneous experiences of images. There's many points in the text where it tells you, do this, do that, in response to this. So it's a very dialogical, interactive thing. And I think one part of that is the types of conceptual and aesthetic expectations that you bring, the world in which you're experiencing these things. And I do think it affects the practice itself, but the larger point is it also affects the way that you experience the practice afterwards, and how you weave that into your life and the outcome and the impact it has upon your life. I mean, I think there's 2 issues here. One is I was raising an issue about thinking about aesthetics in relationship to contemplation, and thinking about that vis-a-vis the literature that articulates that contemplation. And the second thing I raised was the issue of cultural expectations. Like we were talking about, people often say, oh, Tugel was in Kashmir, or it was in this Maoshan Taoism and so forth. And I can guarantee to you it was not. The reason I can guarantee to you it was not, because Tugel is a profoundly Tibetan practice. I'm not saying there aren't related practices like that, but the way that Tibetans articulated it was uniquely Tibetan in character. And I think that's important, even if you can look and see, oh, there's these procedural practices in Chinese Taoism like that, or Kashmiri Shaivism like that. That's not unimportant, but it doesn't trivialize the centrality of those issues. I would say one relevant, for those of you who are interested in Theravada meditation, Kate Crosby wrote this really spectacular book called Traditional Theravada Meditation that completely turns on our head our understanding of Theravada meditation. And her main point is to show that normative Theravada meditation across Southeast Asia a couple centuries ago was very much like Tantric Buddhist meditation that we see in India and in Tibet. And it was a profoundly cultural. It was connected to the Pali language. It was connected to knowledge systems and social formations in those worlds. And that doesn't mean it was less profound. It means it was more profound, because it was part of these people's world of experience. And the reason it went away was because of the colonial rule. And then Vipassana and so forth kind of took its place, because that was much more acceptable. You had a question or comment? Oh.
No, there's a question.
I have a question, David, following up on your last remark back here. Dominic, hi. So are you suggesting, this sounds really interesting, this traditional Theravada meditation book, and you remark on how, unique it is and culturally specific. What's your opinion on the transmission of this type of contemplative practice to the West? Is something lost for the audience if the cultural pastoral imagery is jettisoned in favor of something more familiar, or do you think there's something profoundly important about keeping that distinctively Tibetan image?
Well, if you were to ask me, I think that if it was to ever have any future in America, you would have to translate it into an American experience, just like Tibetans translate into a Tibetan experience. And it would have to take into account the aesthetics of the English language, the aesthetics of how we experience our sensorial realities and so forth. And it doesn't mean that some of us might not participate. I mean, for me, it's extraordinarily moving, the Tibetan version of this. And if there was an American version, believe me, I would not practice it. Just personal level, you know. But I'm someone who spent like 13 years in Tibet, and so it's very moving to me. But I couldn't imagine how something that's so grounded in the Tibetan experience of the world would be equally moving for a large number of Americans. So it needs to be translated, like I think Ken and Anne were both making, into something that makes sense of our collective experience in our language, our bodies and our senses and our imaginaires.
Well, thank you very much. I was thinking about at least a small group of Westerners, you know, should have an immediate experience of before we can create a term, you know, and communicate about it. Because if you let's say, you know, you try to explain what wine and alcohol is, you know, to a society who has no culture of drinking wine, and so you may talk about, you know, the rich flavor of this French wine and that, but nobody will understand you and will understand even the terms, you know. So I think, you know, we first have to probably practice this together, and you know, a group of people need to have an experience, and then we can maybe establish a term, you know, a good English term for it, isn't it? I mean, that's one thing. And the other one is, I was wondering, you know, what came to my mind, you know, is this Tongsuk, you know, in the Kalachakra 6 yoga practice. So do you see any, connection between this, Lukugyu and Tongsuk?
Yeah, so if you want my heretical thoughts on 11th century, that basically the Kalachakra floods into Tibet, and there's a little bit of a delay as they kind of digest it and translate it and so forth. And some people build upon that, and what the people who fashioned the Tugel practice in the Nyingmapa circles, putting aside Bumpo issues, what they did was they basically reimagined that. And I think it's intimately connected to what's going on in the Kalachakra with the Tongsuk and these other practices. But they chose to reimagine it for themselves. They chose to say, you know, no thanks to the Kalachakra, but thank you for a profoundly Tibetan understanding of what these practices look like. And they did it very quickly. They did it in the 1st century, in the wake of the Kalachakra coming into Tibet. And I think the way we understand the Kalachakra now is profoundly influenced by Nyingmapa innovations in Tugel practice and Dzogchen Nyingtik. And so you can't just look at the way Tibetans are talking about the Kalachakra in the 15th century and think that's what Indians were doing. It's been deeply influenced by what Nyingmapas and Bumpos did with those practices. But they did it in this way that was just, you know, non-responsible. It's okay to be non-responsible sometimes, you know? So I think we're, maybe one last question, and then we have to do our group.
This is kind of a historiological question, but I think you know an awful lot about the history of this, so I'm going to take the chance. The supposition that, or the evidence that the Tugel only was invented after the Kalachakra came to Tibet makes a lot of sense, for obvious reasons. But do you believe that Dangma Lunjal invented Tugel, or that he codified a group of practices that existed, or do you know those kind of details?
Well, I mean, if we stick to the documentary evidence as opposed to our visionary testimony, so I have no visionary testimony, I'm not hiding anything from you. The documentary evidence is completely unclear who Dangma Lunki Gyaltsen was and what he did and what he did not do. And the same thing applies for Chetsun Senge Wangchuk. The first major person that we have a solid understanding of is Shangtun Tashi Dorji in the 12th century. So the 11th century is a mysterious time for us in terms of the documentary evidence in relationship to how the early 17 tantras evolved and so forth. But when you look at the materials, I mean, it's a profoundly Tibetan tradition in every way. And it's profoundly indebted to Indian Buddhism, with no question. But that just my point is, it was how Tibetans made sense of these things in their lights, literally, and their skies, and their little link lambs across the hall, and the shepherds. You know, in the allegory, the little boy is called basically the shepherd of the lambs. So, and that's, I think, for our translation and transmission, that's what we need to do.
But you can't point it at the figure of Dongma Lunjal in particular.
I mean, his name is there.
Yeah.
But if you really want to stick to the historical evidence, you can't say much more beyond that. And the same applies to Chetsun Sengye Wangchuk and Che Gom Nakpo, unless you want to get into visionary evidence.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. So I think we have to segue to our collective discussion. Just, right? Did we have a structure to it, or is it just
open questions?
Yeah, okay.
Questions.
Yeah, anybody.
Or comments? Yeah.
I just had a question for David. Usually when Lugu Gid is used, it's Dorje Lugu Gid. What is the Dorje doing?
It's not usually Dorje Lugu Gyu. It's often Dorje Lugu Gyu. It's often just Lugu Gyu. It's almost never Lugu. So there are not lambs floating around. They're always in a chain. But the Dorje part, I think, performs several functions. On the one hand, it strangifies the term. So it just kind of explicitly says, no, these are not lambs. These are not mutton on a stick floating around. And so the Dorje, I think, serves to say, this is something different from what you might think Lugu Gyu means. It also obviously points to the interpretation of Lugu Gyu as the adamantine nature of awareness, because Lugu Gyu is essentially Rigpa, or the dong, or the effulgence of Rigpa. And so I think the Dorje clearly points to that these lambs participate in reality, in the kind of unbreakable or indestructible reality. Yeah, just like Dorje Lu, the Vajra body, right? Of the Tsa, the Lung, and the Tikle.
No, it's not a question. It's an observation about how we approach translation that's becoming a little clearer to me, listening here and to people who've been speaking previously, and I think it's relevant to how I translate too. And
hold it closer.
Okay. So I think the question is whether when we're approaching translation, like kind of how you're doing it, and you're trying to give someone the experience that you have when you read it now, let's say, and you've been practicing for 40, 50 years. So that's one way of translating. And another way is to try to bring them to that experience through possibly, like, Anne, what you were doing with the non-chantable versions, where you're giving them some of the stepping stones and some of the technical terms, the process that you've gone through. I'm not saying this all that well, but process that you've gone through to get there. So one is more path-oriented, maybe you could say, and one is more fruition. It maybe depends on what you...
And it's more what?
Fruition-oriented. And they are slightly different. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. I'll have to work on this if I'm not.
I think you're right. I think you are making a distinction. And frankly, I hadn't thought of it in those terms. And I think you're raising a more general point, which is very important, which is the translator has an intention, and that intention informs the translation.
We see it come out here when we're all translators and we all look at text, and when we first see something new, we start to analyze it. We analyze it in terms of terms, words, how they're put together, pattern, structure. And so when the first verse we looked at, we had Rangshin Mepa. So you would approach that in a different way than what we all are sort of used to, of negating a Rangshin. But what might be missing for your audience in your translation is the process that you've gone through of training and your mind and your understanding about Rangshin and Mepa. In a sense, you're giving them the answer without having taken them through the steps.
That's one. Were you going to speak to that?
No, I'll let you.
You know, I think that's one reason why it may be helpful, especially if we're trying, or at least I feel as I'm trying to do chantable English. I mean, that is a distilled modality, and so I think having and the comment earlier kind of reinforced that, having a non-chantable version that, as you put it, takes you through the steps. I think it is important, and that, for me, the thing that Northrop Frye said, which I didn't know really until recently, about making a distinction between words that take you in and that take you out, which in the Buddhist context I understand to mean, you know, on the path toward fruition, war versus inside, you know, where the fruition might emerge, seems to me increasingly, even through thinking about it in this conference and talking with David and Ken, it seems to me increasingly a kind of important consideration, which I think is what you're also saying. Yeah, thank you.
This is directed to David, and with all due respect, I just feel like I have to mention a strong feeling of being uncomfortable with the discussion of Togal in this kind of a venue. And I feel like, for myself anyway, I've been a translator of Dzogchen for the last 35, 38 years. I've been translating for the greatest Tibetan masters who have come to the West and who have come around the world. And what I've learned is that Togal is never to be separated from Trekchit. However, Togal is found in the 4th cycle of the Upadesha class of Mahasandhi. And when we look at the vehicles of Buddhism, particularly when we look at Mahasandhi, we find that the origin of this is the primordial Buddha, Samantabhadra. And then there are the lineages of wisdom, symbolic indication, and oral transmission. And so the lineage does come down to the Tibetan masters through Vimalamitra and Padmasambhava, but it goes back before that. So it's not limited to just Tibetan understanding. And there's a context that this is always given in, which involves the 3 requirements of empowerment, transmission, and liberating commentary. So I feel uncomfortable that it's being discussed out of that context, and I respectfully have a very different view of the origin of Togal, the source of those terminologies, and the way of understanding the Vajra chain of awareness. And my teaching, my understanding has come from some of the great Khenpos, some of the greatest Khenpos in the tradition. So, I mean, I certainly don't mean to get into a non-productive discussion, but I just felt like in this context, those points should be brought forth too, because it is a whole nother way of looking at this. And in fact, for the practitioners of this tradition, it is the way of looking at this. And in terms of your translation of the Lamb, it was described to me that that was inaccurate just because even from a physical location, the Kangri Tokar is in central Tibet, and the nomads don't really lead their sheep in that area. So at the time of Longchenpa, it's hard to imagine that there were nomadic shepherds herding their sheep and that he would be gazing out and would come up with a term like that. Actually, that term was a translation from the 17 Dzogchen Tantras. So you see, it's a different view, of course, but I don't know that I'm qualified to really debate you on that, nor do I want to. You're much more learned than I am academically, but in terms of my understanding as a translator from what I consider to be very highly learned teachers, I think what I'm presenting right now has some significance.
So thank you for that comment, and I'll just say that obviously we have very different perspectives, and I think that reflects a larger divide within the conference itself that we're trying to, or Tsadra is trying to bridge by bringing people together. And I would just say the one thing that I would say back to that is not to argue this point or that point, but rather to say that we can have profound love and passion and respect for a tradition, and it can manifest in very different ways. And I acknowledge that you have that love and respect for the tradition, and I have my own integrity. And I remember there's a joke I have with Jake Dalton about the last Tsadra thing, where someone in the audience said, "How do you live with yourself?" And you might be thinking that about me right now. And and I like Jake's response, which was like, I do pretty well. But to be honest, this has been my whole life since the age of 20 years old. And I've spent a tremendous amount of time with Tibetans and that you know as well in a broad variety of contexts. And this is the way that integrity manifests for me. And I realize that integrity manifests in a different way for you. And so one of the things that I think is a challenge for us is how to understand different forms of integrity and see where we can find communality and respect across those differences. There are academic treatments of, for example, terma and so forth, that I personally find offensive. Not because I might disagree with the conclusions, but because the way it's been expressed and framed, I don't think it shows respect for the people and the traditions they're involved with. And I do feel like how I've tried to conduct myself and write and express myself, it is based upon a series of values that I hold very dear. And one of those is that I don't really buy into the separation of the sacred and the profane and the profound and the trivial. And one of the things that I felt was gifted to me by Tibet was a realization that the way that I separated these worlds, the common Tibetan world from the extraordinary Tibetan world, was not something I wanted to continue doing. And so there's profundity everywhere. And so Tugel's a very profound thing, but so is a lot of other stuff in this world.
Okay, yeah.
That's okay.